The Julian Chapter by R.J. Palacio. That is only tears such as men use, said Bagheera. Now I know thou art a man, and a man's cub no longer. The jungle is shut indeed to thee henceforward. Let them fall, Mowgli. They are only tears. Rudyard Kipling, The Jungle Book. Oh, the wind is blowing. Through the graves the wind is blowing. Freedom soon will come, then will come from the shadows. Leonard Cohen, The Partisan. Summer Vacation. My parents and I went to Paris in June. The original plan was that we would return to New York in July, since I was supposed to go to rock and roll camp with Henry and Miles. But after everything that happened, I didn't want to do that anymore. My parents decided to let me stay with my grandmother for the rest of the summer. Usually, I hated staying with Grandmère, but I was okay about it this time. I knew that after my parents went home, I would spend the entire day in my PJs playing Halo, and Grandmère wouldn't care in the least. I could pretty much do whatever I wanted. Grandmère wasn't exactly the typical grandma type. No baking cookies for Grandmère, no knitting sweaters. She was, as Dad always said, something of a character. Even though she was in her 80s, she dressed like a fashion model. Super glamorous. Lots of makeup and perfume, high heels. She never woke up until 2 in the afternoon, and then she'd take at least 2 hours to get dressed. Once she was up, she would take me out shopping or to a museum or a fancy restaurant. She wasn't into doing kid stuff, if you know what I mean. She'd never sit through a PG movie with me, for instance, so I ended up seeing a lot of movies that were totally age inappropriate. Mom, I know, would go completely ballistic if she got wind of some of the movies Grandmère took me to. But Grandmère was French, and was always saying my parents were too American, anyway. Grandmère also didn't talk to me like I was a little kid. Even when I was younger, she never used baby words or talked to me the way grown-ups usually talk to little kids. She used regular words to describe everything. Like, if I would say, "Je veux faire pipi," meaning, I want to make pee-pee, she would say, "You need to urinate? Go to the lavatory." And she cursed sometimes, too. Boy, she could curse. And if I didn't know what a curse word meant, all I had to do was ask her, and she would explain it to me, in detail. I can't even tell you some of the words she explained to me. Anyway, I was glad to be away from NYC for the whole summer. I was hoping that I would get all those kids out of my head. Auggie, Jack, Summer, Henry, Miles, all of them. If I never saw any of those kids again, seriously, I would be the happiest kid in Paris. Mr. Browne. The only thing I was a little bummed about is that I never got to say goodbye to any of my teachers at Beecher Prep. I really liked some of them. Mr. Browne, my English teacher, was probably my favorite teacher of all time. He had always been really nice to me. I loved writing, and he was really complimentary about it, and I never got to tell him I wasn't coming back to Beecher Prep. At the beginning of the year, Mr. Browne had told all of us that he wanted us to send him one of our own precepts over the summer. So one afternoon, while Grandmère was sleeping, I started thinking about sending him a precept from Paris. I went to one of the tourist shops down the block and bought a postcard of a gargoyle, one of those at the top of Notre Dame. The first thing I thought when I saw it was that it reminded me of Auggie, and then I thought, ugh, why am I still thinking about him? Why do I still see his face wherever I go? I can't wait to start over. And that's when it hit me. My precept. I wrote it down really quickly. Sometimes it's good to start over. There. Perfect. I loved it. I got Mr. Browne's address from his teacher page on the Beecher Prep website, and I dropped it in the mail that same day. But then, after I sent it, I realized he wasn't going to understand what it meant. Not really. He didn't have the whole background story about why I was so happy to be leaving Beecher Prep and starting over somewhere new. So I decided to write him an email to tell him everything that had happened last year. I mean, not everything. Dad had specifically told me not to ever tell anyone at the school about the mean stuff I did to Auggie, for legal reasons. But I wanted Mr. Browne to know enough so that he would understand my precept. I also wanted him to know that I thought he was a great teacher. Mom had told everyone that I wasn't going back to Beecher Prep because we were unhappy with the academics and the teachers. I felt kind of bad about that because I didn't want Mr. Browne to ever think I was unhappy with him. So anyway, I decided to send Mr. Browne an email to tbrown@beecherschool.edu from Julian at easymail.com. My precept. Hi, Mr. Browne. I just sent you my precept in the mail. Sometimes it's good to start over. It's on a postcard of a gargoyle. I wrote this precept because I'm going to a new school in September. I ended up hating Beecher Prep. I didn't like the students, but I did like the teachers. I thought your class was great, so don't take my not going back personally. I don't know if you know the whole long story, but basically the reason I'm not going back to Beecher Prep is, well, not to name names, but there was one student I really didn't get along with. Actually, it was two students. You can probably guess who they are because one of them punched me in the mouth. Anyway, these kids were not my favorite people in the world. We started writing mean notes to each other. I repeat, each other. It was a two-way street. But I'm the one who got in trouble for it. Just me. It was so unfair. The truth is, Mr. Tushman had it in for me because my mom was trying to get him fired. Anyway, long story short, I got suspended for 2 weeks for writing the notes. No one knows this, though. It's a secret, so please don't tell anyone. The school said it had a zero-tolerance policy against bullying, but I don't think what I did was bullying. My parents got so mad at the school, they decided to enroll me in a different school next year. So yeah, that's the story. I really wish that student had never come to Beecher Prep. My whole year would have been so much better. I hated having to be in his classes. He gave me nightmares. I would still be going to Beecher Prep if he hadn't been there. It's a bummer. I really liked your class, though. You were a great teacher. I wanted you to know that. I thought it was good that I hadn't named names, but I figured he'd know who I was talking about. I really didn't expect to hear back from him, but the very next day, when I checked my inbox, there was an email from Mr. Browne. I was so excited. To Julian at easymail.com from tbrown@beecherschool.edu. RE, my precept. Hi, Julian. Thanks so much for your email. I'm looking forward to getting the gargoyle postcard. I was sorry to hear you wouldn't be coming back to Beecher Prep. I always thought you were a great student and a gifted writer. By the way, I love your precept. I agree. Sometimes it's good to start over. A fresh start gives us the chance to reflect on the past, weigh the things we've done, and apply what we've learned from those things to the future. If we don't examine the past, we don't learn from it. As for the kids you don't like, I do think I know who you're talking about. I'm sorry the year didn't turn out to be a happy one for you, but I hope you take a little time to ask yourself why. Things that happen to us, even the bad stuff, can often teach us a little bit about ourselves. Did you ever wonder why you had such a hard time with these two students? Was it perhaps their friendship that bothered you? Were you troubled by Auggie's physical appearance? You mentioned that you started having nightmares. Did you ever consider that maybe you were just a little afraid of Auggie, Julian? Sometimes fear can make even the nicest kids say and do things they wouldn't ordinarily say or do. Perhaps you should explore these feelings further? In any case, I wish you the best of luck in your new school, Julian. You're a good kid, a natural leader. Just remember to use your leadership for good, huh? Don't forget, always choose kind. I don't know why, but I was so happy to get that email from Mr. Browne. I knew he would be understanding. I was so tired of everyone thinking I was this demon child, you know? It was obvious that Mr. Browne knew I wasn't. I reread his email like 10 times. I was smiling from ear to ear. So? Grandmère asked me. She had just woken up and was having her breakfast, a croissant and a café au lait delivered from downstairs. I haven't seen you this happy all summer long. What is it that you are reading, mon cher? Oh, I got an email from one of my teachers, I answered. Mr. Browne. From your old school? She asked. I thought they were all bad, those teachers. I thought it was good riddance to all of them. Grandmère had a thick French accent that was hard to understand sometimes. What? Good riddance, she repeated. Never mind. I thought the teachers were all stupid. The way she pronounced stupid was funny, like stupid. Not all. Not Mr. Browne, I answered. So, what did he write to make you so happy? Oh, nothing much, I said. It's just, I thought everyone hated me, but now I know Mr. Browne doesn't. Grandmère looked at me. Why would everyone hate you, Julian? She asked. You are such a good boy. I don't know, I answered. Read me the email, she said. No, Grandmère, I started to say. Read, she commanded, pointing her finger at the screen. So I read Mr. Browne's letter aloud to her. Now, Grandmère knew a little bit about what had happened at Beecher Prep, but I don't think she knew the whole story. I mean, I think Mom and Dad told her the version of the story they told everyone else, with maybe a few more details. Grandmère knew there were a couple of kids who had made my life miserable, for instance, but she didn't know the specifics. She knew I'd gotten punched in the mouth, but she didn't know why. If anything, Grandmère probably assumed I had gotten bullied, and that's why I was leaving the school. So there were parts of Mr. Browne's email she really didn't understand. What does he mean? She said, squinting as she tried to read off my screen. Augie's physical appearance. Qu'est-ce que c'est? One of the kids that I didn't like, Auggie, he had like this awful facial deformity, I answered. It was really bad. He looked like a gargoyle. Julian, she said, that is not very nice. Sorry. And this boy? He was not sympathetic, she said innocently. He was not nice to you? Was he a bully? I thought about that. No, he wasn't a bully. So why did you not like him? I shrugged. I don't know. He just got on my nerves. What do you mean you don't know? She answered quickly. Your parents told me you were leaving school because of some bullies, no? You got punched in the face, no? Well, yeah, I got punched, but not by the deformed kid, by his friend. Ah, so his friend was the bully. No, not exactly, I said. I can't say there were bullies, Grandmère. I mean, it wasn't like that. We just didn't get along, that's all. We hated each other. It's kind of hard to explain. You kind of had to be there. Here, let me show you what he looked like. Then maybe you'll understand a little better. I mean, not to sound mean, but it was really hard having to look at him every day. He gave me nightmares. I logged onto Facebook and found our class picture and zoomed in on Augie's face so she could see. She put her glasses on to look at it and spent a long time studying his face on the computer screen. I thought she would react the way Mom had reacted when she first saw that picture of Auggie, but she didn't. She just nodded to herself, and then she closed the laptop. Pretty bad, huh? I said to her. She looked at me. Julian, she said, I think maybe your teacher is right. I think you were afraid of this boy. What? No way, I answered. I'm not afraid of Auggie. I mean, I didn't like him. In fact, I kind of hated him. But not because I was afraid of him. Sometimes we hate the things we are afraid of, she said. I made a face like she was talking crazy. She took my hand. I know what it is like to be afraid, Julian, she said, holding her finger up to my face. There was a little boy that I was afraid of when I was a little girl. Let me guess, I answered, sounding bored. I bet he looked just like Auggie. Grandmère shook her head. No, his face was fine. So why were you afraid of him? I asked. I tried to make my voice sound as disinterested as possible, but Grandmère ignored my bad attitude. She just sat back in her chair, her head slightly tilted, and I could tell by looking into her eyes that she had gone somewhere far away. Grandmère's story. I was a very popular girl when I was young, Julian, said Grandmère. I had many friends. I had pretty clothes. As you can see, I have always liked pretty clothes. She waved her hands down her sides to make sure I noticed her dress. She smiled. I was a frivolous girl, she continued, spoiled. When the Germans came to France, I hardly took any notice. I knew that some Jewish families in my village were moving away, but my family was so cosmopolitan. My parents were intellectuals, atheists. We didn't even go to synagogue. She paused here and asked me to bring her a wine glass, which I did. She served herself a full glass, and as she always did, offered me some too. And as I always did, I said, Non, merci. Like I said, Mom would go ballistic if she knew the stuff Grandmère did sometimes. There was a boy in my school they called him Torto, she continued. He was, how do you say the word? A cripple? Is that how you say it? I don't think people use that word anymore, Grandmère, I said. It's not exactly politically correct, if you know what I mean. She flicked her hand at me. Americans are always coming up with new words we can't say anymore, she said. Alas, well, Torto's legs were deformed from the polio. He needed 2 canes to walk with, and his back was all twisted. I think that's why he was called Torto, crab. He walked sideways, like a crab. I know, it sounds very harsh. Children were meaner in those days. I thought about how I called August the freak behind his back, but at least I never called him that to his face. Grandmère continued talking. I have to admit, at first I wasn't into her telling me one of her long stories, but I was getting into this one. Tortu was a little thing, a skinny thing. None of us ever talked to him because he made us uncomfortable. He was so different. I never even looked at him. I was afraid of him. Afraid to look at him, to talk to him. Afraid he would accidentally touch me. It was easier to pretend he didn't exist. She took a long sip of her wine. One morning, a man came running into our school. I knew him. Everyone did. He was a marquis, a partisan. Do you know what that is? He was against the Germans. He rushed into the school and told the teachers that the Germans were coming to take all the Jewish children away. What? What is this? I could not believe what I was hearing. The teachers in the school went around to all the classes and gathered the Jewish children together. We were told to follow the marquis into the woods. We were going to go hide. Hurry, hurry, hurry. I think there were maybe 10 of us in all. Hurry, hurry, hurry! Escape! Grandmère looked at me to make sure I was listening, which of course I was. It was snowing that morning and very cold, and all I could think was, if I go into the woods, I will ruin my shoes. I was wearing these beautiful new red shoes that Papa had brought me, you see. As I said before, I was a frivolous girl, perhaps even a little stupid. But this is what I was thinking. I did not even stop to think, well, where is Mama and Papa? If the Germans were coming for the Jewish children, had they come for the parents already? This did not occur to me. All I could think about were my beautiful shoes. So instead of following the Marquis into the woods, I snuck away from the group and went to hide inside the bell tower of the school. There was a tiny room up there, full of crates and books, and there I hid. I remember thinking I would go home in the afternoon after the Germans came and tell Maman and Papa all about it. This is how stupid I was, Julian. I nodded. I couldn't believe I had never heard this story before. And then the Germans came, she said. There was a narrow window in the tower, and I could see them perfectly. I watched them run into the woods after the children. It did not take them very long to find them. They all came back together, the Germans, the children, the Marquis soldier. Grandmère paused and blinked a few times, and then she took a deep breath. They shot the Marquis in front of all the children, she said quietly. He fell so softly, Julian, in the snow. The children cried. They cried as they were led away in a line. One of the teachers, Mademoiselle Perjean, went with them, even though she was not Jewish. She said she would not leave her children. No one ever saw her again, poor thing. By now, Julian, I had awakened from my stupidity. I was not thinking of my red shoes anymore. I was thinking of my friends who had been taken away. I was thinking of my parents. I was waiting until it was nighttime so I could go home to them. But not all the Germans had left. Some had stayed behind, along with the French police. They were searching the school. And then I realized they were looking for me. Yes, for me. And for the one or two other Jewish children who had not gone into the woods. I realized then that my friend Rachel had not been among the Jewish children who were marched away, nor Jacob, a boy from another village who all the girls wanted to marry because he was so handsome. Where were they? They must have been hiding just like I was. Then I heard creaking, Julian, up the stairs. I heard footsteps up the stairs, coming closer to me. I was so scared. I tried to make myself as small as possible behind the crate and hid my head beneath a blanket. Here Grandmère covered her head with her arms, as if to show me how she was hiding. And then I heard someone whisper my name, she said. It was not a man's voice. It was a child's voice. Sarah? The voice whispered again. I peeked out from the blanket. Tortu! I answered, astonished. I was so surprised, because in all the years I had known him, I don't think I had ever said a word to him, nor him to me. And yet, there he was, calling my name. They will find you here, he said. Follow me. And I did follow him, for by now I was terrified. He led me down a hallway into the chapel of the school, which I had never really been to before. We went to the back of the chapel, where there was a crypt. All this was new to me, Julian. And we crawled through the crypt so the Germans would not see us through the windows, because they were looking for us still. I heard when they had found Rachel. I heard her screaming in the courtyard as they took her away. Poor Rachel! Tortu took me down to the basement beneath the crypt. There must have been 100 steps at least. These were not easy for Tortu, as you can imagine, with his terrible limp and his 2 canes. But he hopped down the steps 2 at a time, looking behind him to make sure I was following. Finally, we arrived at a passage. It was so narrow we had to walk sideways to get through. And then we were in the sewers, Julian. Can you imagine? I knew instantly because of the smell, of course. We were knee-deep in refuse. You can imagine the smell. So much for my red shoes. We walked all night. I was so cold, Julian. Tortu was such a kind boy, though. He gave me his coat to wear. It was, to this day, the most noble act anyone has ever done for me. He was freezing too, but he gave me his coat. I was so ashamed for the way I had treated him. Oh, Julian, I was so ashamed. She covered her mouth with her fingers and swallowed. Then she finished the glass of wine and poured herself another. The sewers led to Danavillas, a small village about 15 kilometers away from our villas. Maman and Papa had always avoided this town because of the smell. The sewers from Paris drained into the farmland there. We wouldn't even eat apples grown in Danavillas. But it's where Tortu lived. He took me to his house, and we cleaned ourselves by the well. And then Tortu brought me to the barn behind his house. He wrapped me up in a horse blanket and told me to wait. He was going to get his parents. No, I pleaded. Please don't tell them. I was so frightened. I wondered if, when they saw me, they would call the Germans. You know, I had never met them before. But Tortu left. And a few minutes later, he returned with his parents. They looked at me. I must have seemed quite pathetic there, all wet and shivering. The mother, Vivian, put her arms around me to comfort me. Oh, Julian, that hug was the warmest hug I have ever felt. I cried so hard in this woman's arms, because I knew I would never cry in my own maman's arms again. I just knew it in my heart, Julian, and I was right. They had taken Maman that same day, along with all the other Jews in the city. My father, who had been at work, had been warned that the Germans were coming and managed to escape. He was smuggled to Switzerland, but it was too late for Maman. She was deported that day, to Auschwitz. I never saw her again. My beautiful Maman. She took a deep breath here and shook her head. Tortu. Grandmère was silent for a few seconds. She was looking into the air like she could see it all happening again, right in front of her. Now I understood why she'd never talked about this before. It was too hard for her. Tortu's family hid me for 2 years in that barn, she continued slowly. Even though it was so dangerous for them. We were literally surrounded by Germans, and the French police had a large headquarters in Danavillas. But every day I thanked my Maker for the barn that was my home, and the food that Tortu managed to bring me. Even when there was hardly any food to go around. People were starving in those days, Julian. And yet, they fed me. It was a kindness that I will never forget. It is always brave to be kind. But in those days, such kindness could cost you your life. Grandmère started to get teary-eyed at this point. She took my hand. The last time I saw Tortu was 2 months before the liberation. He had brought me some soup. It wasn't even soup. It was water with a little bit of bread and onions in it. We had both lost so much weight. I was in rags. So much for my pretty clothes. Even so, we managed to laugh, Torto and I. We laughed about things that happened in our school. Even though I could not go there anymore, of course. Torto still went every day. At night, he would tell me everything he had learned, so that I would stay smart. He would tell me about all my old friends, too, and how they were doing. They all still ignored him, of course, and he could never reveal to any of them that I was still alive. No one could know. No one could be trusted. But Torto was an excellent narrator, and he made me laugh a lot. He could do wonderful imitations, and he even had funny nicknames for all my friends. Imagine that! Torto was making fun of them. I had no idea you were so mischievous, I told him. All those years, you were probably laughing at me behind my back, too. Laughing at you? He said. Never. I had a crush on you. I never laughed at you. Besides, I only laughed at the kids who made fun of me. You never made fun of me. You simply ignored me. I called you Tortu. And so? Everyone called me that. I really don't mind. I like crabs. Oh, Tortu, I am so ashamed, I answered. And I remember I covered my face with both my hands. At this point, Grandmère covered her face with her hands. Although her fingers were bent with arthritis now, and I could see her veins, I pictured her young hands covering her young face so many years ago. Tortu took my hands with his own hands, she continued, slowly removing her hands from her face. And he held my hands for a few seconds. I was 14 years old then, and I had never kissed a boy. But he kissed me that day, Julian. Grandmère closed her eyes. She took a deep breath. After he kissed me, I said to him, I don't want to call you Tortu anymore. What is your name? Grandmère opened her eyes and looked at me. Can you guess what he said? She asked. I raised my eyebrows as if to say, no, how would I know? Then she closed her eyes again and smiled. He said, my name is Julian. Julian. Oh my God, I cried. That's why you named Dad Julian? Even though everyone called him Jules. That was his name. Oui, she said, nodding. And I'm named after Dad, I said. So I'm named after this kid? That is so cool. She smiled and ran her fingers through my hair, but she didn't say anything. Then I remembered her saying, the last time I saw Tortu. So what happened to him? I asked. To Julian. Almost instantaneously, tears rolled down Grandmère's cheeks. The Germans took him, she said. That same day. He was on his way to school. They were making another sweep of the village that morning. By now, Germany was losing the war, and they knew it. But, I said, he wasn't even Jewish. They took him because he was crippled, she said between sobs. I'm sorry. I know you told me that word is a bad word, but I don't know another word in English. He was an invalid. That is the word in French. And that is why they took him. He was not perfect. She practically spat out the word. They took all the imperfects from the village that day. It was a purge. The gypsies, the shoemaker's son, who was simple, and Julian, my tortu. They put him in a cart with the others, and then he was put on a train to Drancy, and from there to Auschwitz, like my mother. I heard later from someone who saw him there that they sent him to the gas chambers right away. Just like that, poof, he was gone. My savior, my little Julian. She stopped to wipe her eyes with a handkerchief, and then drank the rest of the wine. His parents were devastated, of course. In Bamir and Memphis, she continued. We didn't find out he was dead until after the liberation. But we knew. We knew. She dabbed her eyes. I lived with them for another year after the war. They treated me like a daughter. They were the ones who helped track down Papa, although it took some time to find him. So much chaos in those days. When Papa finally was able to return to Paris, I went to live with him. But I always visited the Bermiers. Even when they were very old, I never forgot the kindness they showed me. She sighed. She had finished her story. Grandmère, I said after a few minutes, that's like the saddest thing I've ever heard. I didn't even know you were in the war. I mean, Dad's never talked about any of this. She shrugged. I think it's very possible that I never told your father this story, she said. I don't like to talk about sad things, you know. In some ways, I am still the frivolous girl I used to be. But when I heard you talking about that little boy in your school, I could not help but think of Tortu, and how afraid I had once been of him, and how badly we had treated him because of his deformity. Those children had been so mean to him, Julian. It breaks my heart to think of it. When she said that, I don't know, something just really broke inside of me. Completely unexpected. I looked down and all of a sudden, I started to cry. And when I say I started to cry, I don't mean a few tears rolling down my cheeks. I mean like full-scale snot-filled crying. Julian, she said softly. I shook my head and covered my face with my hands. I was terrible, Grandmère, I whispered. I was so mean to Auggie. I'm so sorry, Grandmère. Julian, she said again. Look at me. No. Look at me, mon cher. She took my face in her hands and forced me to look at her. I felt so embarrassed. I really couldn't look her in the eyes. Suddenly, that word that Mr. Tushman had used, that word that everyone kept trying to force on me, came to me like a shout. Remorse. Yeah, there it was. That word in all its glory. Remorse. I was shaking with remorse. I was crying with remorse. Julian, said Grandmère, we all make mistakes, mon cher. No, you don't understand, I answered. It wasn't just one mistake. I was those kids who were mean to Torto. I was the bully, Grandmère. It was me. She nodded. I called him a freak. I laughed behind his back. I left mean notes, I screamed. Mom kept making excuses for why I did that stuff, but there wasn't any excuse. I just did it. And I don't even know why. I don't even know. I was crying so hard I couldn't even speak. Grandmère stroked my head and hugged me. Julian, she said softly, you are so young. The things you did, You know they were not right, but that does not mean you are not capable of doing right. It only means that you chose to do wrong. This is what I mean when I say you made a mistake. It was the same with me. I made a mistake with Tortu. But the good thing about life, Julian, she continued, is that we can fix our mistakes sometimes. We learn from them. We get better. I never made a mistake like the one I made with Tortu again. Not with anyone in my life. And I have had a very, very long life. You will learn from your mistake too. You must promise yourself that you will never behave like that with anyone else again. One mistake does not define you, Julian. Do you understand me? You must simply act better next time. I nodded, but I still cried for a long, long time after that. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, become a channel member, and join us in the next video for the end of the story.